Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an editorial from page number 8 of the Delhi edition. This editorial evaluates the key outcomes of the recently held G20 summit, and it points out that the G20 summit came at a crucial moment for the global political economy. See, the G20 or the Group of 20 is an intergovernmental forum that was formed in 1999 involving 19 countries and the European Union. These constitute the 20 largest economies of the world and includes the countries that have been listed over here. So these 19 countries along with the European Union, they represent the 20 largest economies of the world and they include both developed and industrialized nations and as well as developing nations. These 20 largest economies account for nearly 90% of the global GDP and they account for 75 to 80% of global trade. They also represent two-thirds of the global population and as well as roughly 50% of the global land area. So this grouping was formed in 1999 to ensure global financial stability, and the grouping has gained a lot of significance, especially after the 2008 financial crisis. Today, this grouping works on not just issues related to global economic growth and financial stability, but it also looks at issues such as climate change, sustainable development, etc. So just a few days back, a key summit of this grouping took place at Rome in Italy, and it witnessed the participation of the top 20 leaders of these economies. And the editorial points out that this summit took place at a critical moment for the global political economy as it is currently facing several challenges. Because currently, the global political and economic stability has been disturbed and affected by the pandemic, by the impact of climate change and the lack of response against it, and as well as by the weak global financial situation that has been caused by the pandemic. So, as these three challenges are posing a considerable threat to global political stability and financial stability, the G20 countries got together at Rome to work out solutions so that they could deliver a global coordinated response in order to help us tackle these pressing challenges. So during the Rome summit, one of the top focus areas was the COVID-19 pandemic, and the member countries have come to an agreement that the only way in which they can mitigate the impact of the pandemic and contain its further spread is by stepping up vaccine production and distribution, especially to the developing countries and to the smaller nations, in order to help the World Health Organization quickly achieve its vaccination target. See, the WHO has laid down a vaccination target for itself, and it plans to inoculate at least 40% or more of the global population by 2021, that is by the end of this year, and to further scale this up to at least 70% by the mid of next year. To achieve this ambitious target, the WHO would require the support of the developed nations and the large countries, which have the ability to mass produce and distribute these vaccines. So countries like India, European countries, Australia, United States, and the others are going to play a key role in producing and distributing enough vaccines to the other countries so that the vaccination coverage, even in smaller nations, can be stepped up with the help of WHO. This ambitious target of the WHO cannot be achieved without such global cooperation, and thankfully, the countries are trying to create a platform for this through the G20. So the G20 leaders have committed to cooperate and work with each other in order to help the world overcome the gaps in supply and finance with regard to vaccine production and distribution. The next key focus of the G20 summit was the upcoming climate change convention at Glasgow and the climate action priorities and targets of the world. During the G20 summit, which has been held just a few days before the Glasgow summit, the developing countries were using the opportunity to remind the developed nations that they have failed to fulfill their commitment of climate finance, under which they had committed to raise $100 billion every year since 2020 to fund adaptation and mitigation measures in developing nations. So at the G20 summit, the developed nations have taken a pledge again to fulfill these earlier commitments with regard to climate finance so that they can promote adaptation and mitigation measures in the developing nations and help them adopt greener and cleaner technologies to enable their transition towards a greener economy. But despite these renewed commitments, the divide and the differences between the developed countries and developing nations was very evident at the G20 summit as well. And these differences are likely to play out again at the ongoing Glasgow summit of the Climate Change Convention. Even as countries like India are being forced by the other countries to accept the net zero emission targets, India has managed to do well at the G20 summit to keep this pressure away from the developed nations. And this success of India can be seen in the statement that has been issued after the G20 summit. The final G20 statement does give a lot of focus and attention to climate change and recommits the world to the target of keeping global temperatures under 1.5 degrees Celsius and gives utmost focus to sustainable development and responsible consumption. But however, it doesn't contain any direct references to net zero emissions and doesn't speak about any deadline or targets which had been pushed back by India. So, in this regard, India seems to have protected its interests at the G20. So, it would be interesting to see as to what India would do at the ongoing Glasgow summit. But the fact that the G20 could be used by developing nations to highlight the importance of climate finance and to push the developed countries to live up to their commitments highlights the significance of the G20 platform. Then, coming to the core agenda of the G20, the member countries focused on the key economic challenges that lie ahead of us in a post COVID world. As the pandemic crippled the global economy due to the imposition of lockdowns, it has threatened global stability, and around the world, countries are struggling to stage an economic recovery. So, in order to help stabilize their economies and to promote economic growth and recovery, almost every major country has announced its own national stimulus to support their industries, their farmers, in order to ensure financial stability during the disruption caused by the pandemic, and also to ensure the recovery of economic growth. But however, the question is, how long can governments sustain this national stimulus? And what would be the appropriate time to withdraw the stimulus? Because any premature withdrawal will adversely affect the nascent recovery that is going on in the economy. And at the same time, if it is continued for a prolonged period, it might affect financial stability due to the rising fiscal burden of sustaining such a stimulus package. Parallelly, countries are dealing with rising inflation, increasing energy prices as the demand is bouncing back, and unprecedented disruption to global supply chain caused by the unlocking of economies around the world. So the top economies are struggling to find a balance between these conflicting interests because on one hand, they want to continue the stimulus to ensure financial stability and to further promote economic growth and recovery. But at the same time, they want to manage the fiscal pressures as well. So any premature withdrawal of the stimulus or even the unnecessary prolonging of the stimulus can adversely affect the ongoing recovery. And governments will have to be mindful of rising inflation, rising energy prices, and the continuing disruption in global supply chains. So, keeping all these factors in mind, the G20 countries have resolved to continue the respective stimulus packages until an appropriate time where it can be guaranteed that our economies are overcoming the impact of the pandemic and the lockdowns. So, as these economies have decided to continue the respective stimulus packages, there is a need to further boost government revenue so that the government can continue funding the stimulus package without fearing the rising fiscal burden. So, in the interest of boosting government revenue, the top economies have proposed a global minimum tax, and this is being worked out to the G20 platform. A global minimum tax will reduce the attractiveness of low tax jurisdictions because currently large companies and MNCs they are taking advantage of low tax jurisdictions by locating themselves over here, thereby avoiding taxes in large countries where their business is actually focused upon. So, if a global minimum tax is adopted by all major economies, It will reduce the attractiveness of low tax jurisdictions, and the large corporates, the MNCs, and the big companies would be forced to pay the due taxes in the countries where their operations are concentrated in, thus boosting revenue to those governments, which in turn could be used by them to sponsor welfare programs and the stimulus package. So, nearly 136 countries are backing the proposal to introduce a global minimum tax, and it is likely to enter into force from 2023 onwards. But however, on this key issue, there are still few differences, and through the G20 platform, the top 20 economies are trying to resolve these differences so that the stability of the global economy can be guaranteed. So, if these top 20 economies work together and coordinate their action, then they can ensure global economic recovery by dealing with all the pressing challenges, be it the pandemic or climate change and differences over climate change targets, or even the mounting challenges being faced by the global economy as it adapts to the disruption present in a post COVID era. That's the reason why the editorial says that the Rome summit of the G20 came at a critical moment for the global political economy, and coordinated action amongst these countries is the only way out in order to guarantee global financial stability and economic recovery. Now, let's look at a column from page number 9 that deals with cryptocurrencies and the massive bull run that we have seen in its prices over the last few months. See, back in 2018, the Reserve Bank of India had issued a notice that restricted and prohibited the use of cryptocurrencies and digital currencies, and it also restricted the functioning of cryptocurrency exchanges. But this circular of the RBI was overturned by the Supreme Court in March 2020, and it became a watershed moment for cryptocurrencies in India. Following the Supreme Court verdict, cryptocurrencies witnessed a massive boom and adoption by retail investors, which was also aided by the uncertainties created by the pandemic. So, as the prices of various cryptocurrencies have skyrocketed, the writer says that this is purely speculative mania, and he takes a one sided view to state that cryptocurrencies do not possess any significant value of their own, and there is no reason to support the sustenance of their current high prices. See, in several previous classes, we have spoken about cryptocurrencies and digital currencies such as Bitcoin, Ethereum, and the others. And we have not only understood the technology behind it, that is the blockchain technology, but we have even spoken about the pros and cons of cryptocurrencies. But here in this column, the writer is taking a one sided view where he is talking about the limitations of cryptocurrencies as an asset and the limitations of cryptocurrencies as a viable currency for exchange and use. See, one of the key advantages enjoyed by cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin is that their supply is limited. There is a maximum cap on the number of Bitcoins that can be eventually available, as per the white paper that was published by an anonymous entity known as Satoshi Nakamoto, who is said to have introduced the revolutionary blockchain technology that forms the basis of cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin. When Satoshi Nakamoto envisioned Bitcoin, its maximum supply was kept limited to 21 million so as to preserve and protect its value. This limited supply of few cryptocurrencies is often said to be a hedge against the unlimited supply of money that is brought out by the central bank with regard to fiat currencies. See, in a traditional economy, fiat currencies are controlled by the central bank and the respective governments, and the printing and supply of this currency is managed by them centrally as per their monetary policy and fiscal policy in order to manage inflation, promote growth, bridge the budget deficit of the government, and to help the government to run its welfare programs and to tax the people. So, in a traditional economy, the supply and printing of money is tightly regulated in a centralized manner through the central banks and the government. But this ability of the central banks to print money whenever they want is set to lead to inflation as the fiat currency starts losing its value. So, in order to shield against this inflationary tendency of fiat currencies, investors tend to adopt alternative assets such as gold and silver, which have their own intrinsic value so that they can protect their wealth and use it as a hedge against inflation. But this is where cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin gained a lot of popularity due to their limited supply. And the proponents of cryptocurrencies, they have championed it as a hedge against the inflationary pressures of fiat currencies and as a protection against the monopoly of the central bank and the government that they enjoy over money supply in the market. But according to the writer, the fact that few cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin have a limited supply alone is not sufficient to give them any real value. Because according to him, any currency or any such asset needs to have either a use value or an exchange value or an intrinsic fundamental value. For example, commodities such as oil, iron, and steel, they have a use value because these commodities are used to run industries, to manufacture products, to run vehicles, and to create real estate. So, commodities like oil, iron, and steel, they have a use value. Then, assets such as stocks, they have an exchange value. Stocks and even bonds possess such exchange value, which is based on the expected future cash flow from these assets. Because when you present these stocks and bonds at an exchange, you're guaranteed a return with the equivalent of its value being paid in the form of fiat currency. Then assets like gold and silver have a fundamental intrinsic value of their own because of their precious nature and the way in which it acts as a hedge against inflation and the fact that they are widely used in making jewelries. According to the writer, cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin do not enjoy either of the value. The writer says Bitcoin does not have usage value, does not have exchange value, and it doesn't have a fundamental intrinsic value. In his view, cryptocurrencies are purely speculative, which in turn makes the currency or the asset extremely volatile. See, today there are crypto exchanges where you can exchange cryptocurrencies, not just for other cryptocurrencies, but also for fiat currency. But the problem the writer is pointing out is that cryptocurrencies are not legally accepted in most of the countries. And since the fundamental concept and technology behind cryptocurrencies directly challenges the government's monopoly over money, it's highly likely that cryptocurrencies are going to be banned or restricted or strictly regulated, thereby destroying the limited exchange value that they have. But cryptocurrencies do not have any use value directly because it's not a physical currency and they don't have any intrinsic fundamental value like gold or silver. It does possess exchange value as it has been widely adopted around the world, especially by retail investors. But the lack of institutional adoption and the fact that it counters the centralized money system managed by the government and the central bank makes it vulnerable to government crackdown and government action, thereby rendering the currency without any actual value. See, governments desire to have this centralized control over money because this is what gives governments their power. The power of the government to impose taxes, the power of the government to run welfare schemes, the power of the government to raise funds and debt for bridging its budget deficits is all directly dependent on the authority of the government and the central bank to print money as they want and to spend money as they want. So, in the traditional centralized economy, it is the government and the central bank which have a complete monopoly over fiat currencies, and this is the very root of the power that is enjoyed by the government. But the very concept of cryptocurrencies and the technology behind it provides for a decentralized system where the government and the central bank lose complete control over these cryptocurrencies is in direct opposition to the monopoly that is enjoyed by the government and the central banks. So this is what leads governments to crack down on cryptocurrencies. And as you have seen, countries like China have implemented a complete ban on such digital currencies. So even while countries like India and US are hesitant to impose an outright ban like China, the writer says that cryptocurrencies are going to remain speculative because of this, and their extreme volatility will make them unsuitable to be seen as a currency or an asset which possesses some value. Now let's look at an important column from page number 8, which examines the extent of water crisis in the country. The writer says that, considering the complexity and the scale of water crisis that is facing India, it is important for the government to work out an integrated approach so that all the concerned ministries, departments, and grassroots institutions are working towards the common goal of promoting water conservation and efficient usage of water. In this regard, he appreciates the creation of the Ministry of Jal Shakti in 2019 by merging the Ministries of Water Resources, River Development, and Ganga Rejuvenation with the Ministry of Drinking Water and Sanitation. This merger provided the central government an opportunity to take a holistic look at the looming water crisis in the urban areas and the rural areas. Previously, the water related issues of urban and rural areas were being looked after by separate ministries, but the merger of these two ministries into a single Ministry of Jal Shakti has helped in putting in place an integrated approach towards water management. The writer says that if we have to truly understand the extent of water crisis that is facing both our urban and rural areas, then first we need to identify the primary sources of drinking water for the urban and rural areas. Studies have shown that in rural areas, nearly 80 to 90% of the drinking water supply and 75% of the water used for agriculture is met through groundwater sources. So, in rural areas, for both drinking water and as well as for irrigation, there is excessive dependency on groundwater sources. The same can be said about urban areas as well. Studies have shown that nearly 50 to 60% of the water supply in urban areas is drawn again from groundwater sources. The rest is met through surface water, that is through rivers, lakes and tanks and reservoirs. But majority of the supply in the urban areas also comes from groundwater sources. So in this context, it becomes very important to take a look at Niti Aayog's Water Management Index, which was released in 2019. This study of Niti Aayog showed that most of the cities in India are on the brink of exhausting their groundwater resources in just a few years, as the demand for water in nearly 21 cities is expected to double by 2030, which is going to drive an unprecedented exploitation of our groundwater resources. So this alarming finding highlights the extent of water crisis facing the country, and the writer takes the examples of cities such as Chennai and Mumbai, and even the rural areas of Punjab to further highlight the water crisis. See, recently in 2019, Chennai faced a major water crisis despite having witnessed massive floods during most of the years. The same can be said about Mumbai as well. Even though the city witnesses heavy rainfall and frequent floods, every now and then a water crisis is reported. And the problem lies with the inability of the groundwater system in the cities to recharge due to the encroachment of floodplains and wetlands in the city, which have been completely taken over by urbanization. So there isn't sufficient space for water to percolate and to recharge the underground water table. And this directly contributes to water shortage in these cities, even though they receive sufficient rainfall. And it highlights the importance of protecting the floodplains and the wetlands and the urban water bodies. Then in the rural areas of Punjab, an acute water crisis is being reported by the Central Groundwater Board because the groundwater table has been overexploited since the days of the Green Revolution, as the farmers have relied upon water intensive crops such as paddy, which has not only turned the water highly saline in the region, but is also leading to water shortages, thereby aggravating pressure on agriculture and as well as creating shortages of drinking water in rural Punjab. So to solve these challenges, what we need is synergy between government institutions and an integrated approach where the center can work with the states and the grassroots institutions to craft and implement a water conservation program which gives maximum focus for conserving and preserving our water sources, along with promoting the efficient usage of water. See, currently under the Ministry of Jal Shakti, a new national water policy is being drafted, and the writer says that if India has to avert this water crisis, then the new national water policy should focus on encouraging the conservation of our water resources, such as our groundwater table, and by promoting efficient usage practices to minimize waste so that we can sustainably manage the country's water resources. Now let's look at this article from page number 1. The Prime Minister has stated that India will achieve net zero emissions by 2070. While participating in the 26th Conference of Parties to the Climate Change Convention at Glasgow, the Prime Minister of India has stated that India will achieve net zero emissions by 2070. But however, this doesn't mean that India has taken up the net zero emission targets. See, this is a statement being made by the Prime Minister to tell the world that India is going to achieve net zero emissions by 2070 without taking up any restrictive targets which are being pushed upon India by the other countries. Prior to leaving for the summit, the government made its official stand known that India won't be forced by other countries to take up net zero emission targets. So, to highlight India's progress towards adoption of renewable energy and to highlight India's contribution towards achieving the Paris targets, the Prime Minister has said that by 2030, India will ensure that 50% of its energy will come from renewable sources with a 450 gigawatt installed capacity. And India is already working on reducing its carbon emissions to bring down the emissions intensity per unit of GDP by less than 45%. The Prime Minister has even said that India is raising this target to have a 500 gigawatt installed capacity of renewable energy to go one step beyond the Paris targets that we have announced. And these mitigation measures, which are designed to bring down India's emissions, along with India's focus on afforestation and carbon sequestration and carbon capture, is set to help India achieve carbon neutrality by 2070. So, India being the only major emitter which has not officially committed to a target or a deadline to achieve net zero, it is being brought under tremendous pressure by the United States, by the European Union, and China to adopt an official target with a strict deadline. But the Indian Prime Minister has made it clear that India is already on its way to achieve net zero emissions by 2070, and we need not prescribe this as a binding target or a commitment on India. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: the recent G20 meeting came at a critical moment for the global political economy. Examine its key outcomes. The second question: scarcity alone is not sufficient to facilitate the adoption of cryptocurrencies as money. Analyze. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be given in the description box. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.